This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, an international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. To join our global community and access member-only webinars, events, a wide range of digital learning offerings, coaching and leadership resources, accreditation schemes, and more, you can find us at associationforcoaching.com. Hello and welcome back to another episode where we explore the conscience and consciousness of coaching. My name is George Warren. I'm a coach, supervisor, and mentor coach, and I'm really honoured to be the host for this series. My guest today is Richard Boyatzis. Richard is one of the leading academics in the coaching and leadership space. He's done a lot of work over at Case Western Reserve University, where he's a professor, and he's written over 125 books on the topics of psychology, cognitive science, and organizational behavior. So I was really honored and thrilled to get the chance to speak to him and pick his brains around topics including the coaching world and the state it's in now. And in today's episode, I hear his thoughts on effective coaching and leadership in working with primary emotions. We speak about resonance, compassion, mindfulness, playfulness, spirituality, navigating tricky times, narcissism, and Richard shares his experience in how we can work against the outdated command and control form of leadership. And what I appreciate about Richard is that so much of what he says is backed up with data and science and numbers. It's a fascinating conversation. So here it is, Richard Boyatzis. Richard, a real pleasure to connect with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Would it be helpful to start by you saying a little bit about the work that you do?
Well, I like to think of myself as a liberator. I try to practice liberation education and try to help people liberate their passions and desires, both individually and collectively. So the idea isn't to help individuals liberate their passions in a way that might harm others or not be considerate of a person's social responsibility. But nonetheless, too many people, especially in helping professions, live their lives of obligation. They live their lives in terms of their ought self, the ideal self that others have told them they should have. And very often I pick up these folks in their 40s or 50s in my degree courses or in executive programs at Case Western Reserve University because they finally get to their second or third midlife crisis and say, hey, I'm not doing what I really love doing. Now, coaching ends up being one of these fascinating arenas. I mean, I started formally coaching executives in 1969. It was a way I was paying myself through my PhD program at Harvard. But I actually started doing research on coaching in the form of helping back in 67. That's what got me out of the aerospace field, actually. And, I'm fascinated by the number of people who discover that they have certain desires or skills that they want to contribute to others. And regardless of their past, as a manager, as a teacher, as a therapist, as a cleric, they all of a sudden realize that they can help people by this advanced form of being a bartender, of listening well and asking a poignant question here and there. I don't mean bartender in the sense of serving drinks. I don't want to encourage substance abuse, but I meant it in terms of the classic image of a really good bartender as being somebody who listens. And, I think really good coaching is, of course, dependent on listening, but it's much more than that. But the fact is that an amazing number of people, I have regularly MDs and psychiatrists and nurses who hit a certain point, often in their 40s or around 50, and say, I'm tired of treating this illness. I'm tired of treating anorexics. I'm tired of, helping people get through emergency surgery. I'd like to have some balance. And they start to discover that a lot of the skills and, if you will, caring that they've developed could easily make it into this other field. So that's what I'm about. I've been about, my main theme in my life since 1967 has been the theory I've been working on since then called intentional change theory, about how individuals all the way through countries experience and go through sustained desired change. Well, one of the crucial levels of that are dyads, and that brought me to actually doing a lot of studying about the coaching relationship, which is a great. I mean, in many of my executive programs, I teach the dyad level of sustained desired change through coaching, because coaching is such a beautiful both example of and metaphor of the qualities of relationships that work, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a therapist, like I said, a cleric or whatever. So, yeah, that's kind of what I'm about.
Mm,
I'm technically a nerd. I love doing research. I love numbers.
mm,
I got known. I am known in a lot of circles because I'm seen as one of the 5 people who started the competency movement in human resources. I did the first actually empirical competency study against performance indicators in 1970. So I'm associated with that whole thing. And then somewhere in the 90s, all the competencies except the cognitive ones got relabeled emotional intelligence. So very often people know me from that. But
mm,
the reality is I got into that for a very odd reason. I was working with alcoholics and drug addicts, and they're what you're trying to help them learn to do. And I was training therapists on how to do it and doing some basic research. Then it's clear what you're trying to do. You're trying to help them get clean, re-enter their families, become a human again, a citizen. Not, of course, they're human, but I mean,
mm,
become a functioning citizen and so forth. But when I started to look at the wide range of people that didn't have behavioral addictions, that weren't suffering from things like chronic pain or lifelong diseases, you start to ask the question, okay, well, what are you helping them about?
mm,
And that's where the whole competency thing started. And actually, oddly enough, the very first competency model, empirical study that I did was on looking for what are the characteristics that differentiated outstanding supervisory naval chaplains from their average performing counterparts. So it was actually even looking at clerics, but in the U.S.
mm,
Navy. So leap ahead. I mean, I've been studying that both physiologically and psychologically and behaviorally. And like I said, besides individual change and dyad change, I've also
mm.
studied team change and organization change, and have written some papers on community and country change. But I think given the people who normally listen to your podcast, I think the coaching, which is in particular, how do you build the kind of relationships in dyads where the coaching is both effective and sustainable? And then how do you, in the process of coaching, act with another person in a way that helps that person evolve?
Mm. And I've followed your work for a number of years, and ever since I caught a webinar of yours. And one of the words that I forever associate with you and your work is the term resonance. And I've heard you speak about resonant leadership.
Right.
I'm wondering if you'd care to say a bit more around that phrase resonance.
Sure.
And how it can be not only important but integral to effective leadership or effective coaching.
An editor at Harvard Business Review Press was talking to Dan Goleman, who he and I were classmates in our PhD program together at Harvard and stayed good friends and colleagues. But she was talking to him in the late 90s about doing a book on emotional intelligence and leadership. Meanwhile, she was talking to me about doing a book on change and how you help develop leaders. And he and I were both in Boston for a meeting, and the three of us had a long, prolonged coffee. And she said, well, why don't you do a book together? And we had done a lot of other things together. So we said, sure. And in the process of writing what became Primal Leadership, which, I say with pride, but is out in 31 languages and was on the international bestseller list for about a year and a half. But what happened was it became very clear. And then one of my former doctoral students, Annie McKee, joined us. And the three of us realized that to talk about emotional and social intelligence was hollow if you didn't talk about the quality of the relationships. And although we might have started out with leadership, right now, I would say it is the model. And empirically, the research keeps coming back to this, showing how having resonant relationships, coaching relationships, is really the key. Now, oddly enough, the term resonance comes from physics, but In fact, when we were wrestling with how to frame that book, I had read a book by 3 neurologists that were talking about limbic resonance in primates and infants and human mothers. And they were talking about literal brain-to-brain sympathetic resonance, how they're setting off the same things directly, quite unconsciously. And as we talked about it, it became very clear that the whole notion that we often have that leadership or helping is an influence and top down, yes, it's an influence action or role or relationship, but it's really wrong to use any analogies that it's a top down process, because that's not how it's effective. And we've got, data back from the 1930s and 40s all the way through, even in the military, to say that effective leadership is not top down. It's not command and control. And in military terms, it's ask and inspire. And then all of a sudden we started realizing that that's at the heart of an awful lot of what we've been working on. I mean, when I was in training to be a therapist, Carl Rogers' ideas were very key about genuineness and being a person, and the kind of philosophical notions of Martin Buber and creating an I-thou relationship were very driving. So what we now can say, some 25, almost 27 years later into the research on this, is that when people have these relationships where they feel they are in tune with each other, in sync with each other, that's where the magic happens. And, more want to align yourself behind some boss's notion of what your strategy is or what you should be doing, then you want to align yourself to your in-laws' messages or your spouse or partner's messages about how you should be acting. We just don't want to be aligned. But being in tune opens things up. And we now have both the behavioral and psychological and even the neurological evidence to say when you interact with somebody, there are a number of characteristics that seem to set off primary emotions that open people up to new ideas and to other humans and emotions, and even making better moral assessments of what's fair and just. One of those is hope, the emotion of hope. Well, it turns out when you talk about vision, what's your vision? What's your dream of the future? Not goals. I was just writing about this in a chapter in my new book, that goals actually constrain people's consideration of alternatives. And every time we fall prey to saying to somebody, and this happens in a whole bunch of the coach certification things, you have to talk about specific goals that the client presents, and that's all you should take as the contract. Let me use an analogy to show how idiotic that is. If I'm not feeling well, I go on the internet and I check out all of my symptoms and I come up with a diagnosis. Then I check out on the internet what treatments are the best for that diagnosis. If I then went to my internist, my primary care physician, and said, Doctor, here, it happens to be Dr. Paul Wong, but Dr. Wong, here's what I have, here's my prescription, what I need, can you write me a script for that? If he does, he should lose his license. What makes us as coaches think that the client's presenting problem is even the problem, other than a symptom, that it's their current framing of what they need relief on? So, and I'm not saying it's not legitimate, and of course you have to address their presenting affect, but the context for change is not solving a problem. It's what you dream your life should be. It's bigger. It's the big picture. And that's what we've discovered in a series of fMRI studies, and we've discovered in 39 longitudinal studies of behavior change, that it's when you talk to people about, here's the question. This is the question that should be the most important opening context, other than, hi, my name is, in a coaching relationship. If your life were fantastic, were ideal 10 to 15 years from now, what would it be like? And if you can get people to reflect, to play with that, and it doesn't happen in a simple thing. Not everybody thinks about this day to day. I've coached presidents of divisions, really potent people, that sometimes it's taken 3 one-hour coaching sessions spread out over 2 months to finally get them to come up with their dream. Because what we also have found out that for this vision to be more effective in terms of helping people open up and being a driver, a genuine driver of change or consideration of change, it has to be holistic. So, we look for what's your desired image of your physical health 10 to 15 years from now, your spiritual health, your romantic health, your family relationships, your contributions to the community, and work. But it's not centered. I mean, work is a subset of life. So what we've continued to discover and reify from what some other people were suggesting, like Torrey Higgins from Columbia with his looking at promotion versus prevention, self-regulatory focus, or what I like to think of this as the person's big picture. So, I mean, it is typical that if somebody comes to me for a coaching session, and after we introduce ourselves, I'll, say something like, "What brings you here?" And they'll present the problem. Depending upon the nature of the problem, I might, at that moment, or I might wait, talk about it for a minute or two, no more than 2 minutes, and then say, this is really important. Let's come back to this. But first, can we step back and let me get a sense of the big picture of you? I want to understand who you are and what you want out of life, because that helps us with the context. And the research shows that when you do specific goal setting or focused problem solving, you go into two neural networks that put blinders on people, literally close down their peripheral vision, and they get into this mode of analyzing things that, as my friend and colleague, Professor Tony Jack of Case Western Reserve, has developed this research that colleagues of his worked on a number of years ago also, that very often, as soon as we go down that path, we're more focused. And that helps us make a decision or decide, what to have for dinner or solve a problem. But we now know that neurologically, it shuts you off to consideration of alternatives. So if you're pursuing something as vague or fuzzy as your desired future, you don't want to start by getting specific. Goals are useful in a change process later on when you're trying to focus, when you want to limit awareness of what's going on. And we see this replicate in teams and organizations all the time. In strategic planning discussion, it's called competition neglect, when people are so focused on what they think their products are that they refuse to notice. I mean, in strategy classes, they teach about, the people who were in the buggy whip business who refused to consider an alternative to horse-drawn carriages as a mode of transportation. I remember one of my executive doctoral teams who was studying how Kodak lost the digital imaging market, and Fuji, among other things, was even winning in the photo film market. And Kodak executives became so focused and preoccupied with Fuji that they missed they kept saying, nobody wants digital photography. The images aren't good. The quality's not good. Fuji's a threat because their color quality is better. We're focused on what Fuji's doing with their color film. And now here's the kicker. Kodak owned the first patents to a digital camera in 1974 and 5. They could have owned the market, and they lost it. They lost it to other people who had a different vision. And then, of course, the ultimate visionary and encouraging that, Steve Jobs, took it with the iPhone, a whole new level. A second major one is compassion, which very often is the experience of gratitude and caring. And what we find is, although people like to think they're tough and instrumental, the more effective people as coaches, as well as leaders, parents, clerics, teachers, et cetera, are ones who the other person feels you genuinely care about them. They're not just a human resource. They're not just a cog that you're trying to squeeze more out of. A third primary emotion is, the jargony word is mindfulness, but it's really being centered. And that's a moment of serenity, of, if you will, being consistent and present in the sense of with yourself. A fourth that we should add, although it's subject to a little bit of cultural differences, is playfulness. Playfulness works wonders with this. And what each of those experiences have in common is they hit a primary emotion, which activates parts of our parasympathetic nervous system, neural networks, and positive emotions that open us up to new ideas and other people. So, what would help the efficacy of coaching? If we as coaches spend a lot more time making sure that the person we're talking to really wants to make these changes and the changes are big and meaningful to them. So that either awed you or dumbfounded.
Well, having followed some of your work, am I right that you've been talking about the PEA and the NEA?
What I call the positive emotional attractor and the negative emotional attractor are two tipping points. Now, what does that mean? The concept of tipping points comes out of complexity theory. And Ed Lorenz in 1963 first coined this expression of strange attractors. In complexity theory, very often they do this with mathematical modeling, but let me be simplistic. Most of the time, when it comes to human behavior, there are many different types of attractors, but two in our internal system are strange attractors and limit point cycle attractors. Strange attractors are things that draw you to them like a magnet, but don't make you attached to them. They're more like the magnetic field, a gravitational field, if you will, of the sun, that all of a sudden you start to orbit around the strange attractor. The limit point cycle draws you into it like a black hole. My observation a number of decades ago was that there is no resistance to change. I mean, anytime somebody says that, my skin crawls because I realize they're out to lunch. They're not understanding what they're looking at. People aren't resisting change. They're attracted to something else. And very often the thing they're attracted to is something that's more defensive. It's more stable and predictable. It feels safer or more certain. And in a large sense, that's a default for the human condition for ecological terms. Well, I started to study these things in a different way, looking at it wasn't just positive and negative feelings. It was also basic hormonal functioning, parasympathetic versus sympathetic, or what we call in shorthand renewal hormonal systems versus stress. And then parts of the empathic, or Tony Jack's term, or default mode network neurologically versus the task positive network. And that I realized in looking at the research that had been done in up to the 90s, and then the various studies that doctoral students working with me and others had done, including myself, that if you label this one cluster of these three dimensions of affect and neural activation and hormonal activation as a positive emotional attractor, and the other is the negative emotional attractor, they are alternatives, and a person is drawn around each one. Now, the problem is because the negative emotional attractor is necessary. I mean, I call it the survival issue. I mean, you couldn't have woken up this morning if you didn't activate that. But if all you do in life is survive, it's like T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, sexism in the title aside, but it's a hollow existence if all you do is seek to survive. Now, sadly, there are billions of people alive on Earth today who are struggling with that, whether in impoverished areas or climate change affected areas or wars. But for many of us that are professionals, that are managers, executives, for the 400 or 500 million of us that are in such a blessed, or you could say privileged state, our challenge is not just to survive, it's also to thrive or flourish, as some people call it. And it's in that other state that you find engagement, excitement. You start to focus on possibilities instead of problems. You start to focus on the dream instead of a goal. You start to focus on novelty versus performance improvement. And they're two very different states. What happens with us at very fast speeds, I mean, usually under a second, our bodies can shift these modes. Now, we experience a lot of mild stressors in a daily life. A cell phone drops a call, besides the acute stressors of COVID and financial threats and social disruptions, and all that stuff piles on. So even pre-COVID, most of us were suffering from chronic stress or strain. Well, the only antidote you can't fix that by lowering the amount of stress. What you have to do is elevate the amount of renewal. And that's where this positive emotional attractor, this PEA state comes in. Because the only way to alleviate the negative effects of the negative emotional attractor, of the stress and excessive analytic thinking and negative bias, is to have these other moments. And that's where a coach can become instrumental in helping a person break out of their, if you will, their funk. And I had this argument when I was training therapists in the 70s and working with alcoholics and drug addicts. I used to rail against therapists who just sat there and had their, whether individually or in group therapy, had their people go on and on about how miserable their life was and their problems. And it just struck me that what they were doing was enabling people to feel worse and worse. And that's what I think we have to avoid. We want to be empathic and we want to be supportive and we want to validate when people are hurting or in pain. But we also don't want to enable it by saying, let me encourage you to wallow in the muck and the mire of how much your life sucks or how much your job is depleting all of your energy. That's where the PEA comes in. And Dan Goleman and Udayan Dar and Kalu Osiri colleagues and I just published an article about a little over a year ago. Dan and I, about 7 years ago, had come up with a self-assessment device that people could look at their week-to-week typical experiences of renewal versus stress. And we did it for a very large high-tech company as a client where the CEO had asked us for this help. And it worked so well in the research that, we decided to do another set of studies. So I got our IRB, our ethics board at the university's approval, and did another set of studies. Those are the ones we published, showing that if you have more moments of, let's just call this renewal in terms of this positive emotional attractor state in a day, in a week, than you have of stress, you feel more engaged, you have a higher sense of well-being, you're more satisfied with your life, you demonstrate more empathy to others, you're less anxious, less nervous, you're more resilient, et cetera, et cetera. And then we discovered that if you have more variety in the activities that bring you into this positive renewal state during a typical week, it also creates all of these good things and reduces the negative things. In fact, the variety was a little more potent than the amount of time. So we're drawn to the inexorable conclusion that as coaches and as people for ourselves, being sustainable ourselves as coaches, we want to pay attention to having more of these PEA renewal moments each day and each week. And the secret isn't to fixate on how do I carve out a whole hour. As a matter of fact, I would suggest that the real key is how do you have more 10 to 15 minute moments in a day, scattered throughout the day, and then scattered throughout the week? How do you make sure there's a variety of things so you aren't just trading, one habit or addiction for another? You don't just work out or 6 hours a day or meditate 4 hours a day. You do a whole bunch of other things, some of which you do by yourself and some of which you are doing with your family or friends or coworkers. But the idea being we rejuvenate ourselves, if you will. I mean, I'm sure you and any of the listeners know there are people who, when you interact with them, you feel like all the air got sucked out of you. They're not quite as extreme, but like the dementors of the prison of Azkaban. And you feel deflated, or, you walk out of a meeting and you just feel like, oh my God, that was horrible. Well, these moments of PEA and renewal do the opposite. And in a sense, they re-energize. And it is true to say they refresh you. But now we have the neurological and psychological evidence to say that really does. So this concept of these tipping points or trigger points is, how do you use them to manage yourself and your own excitement? How do you use it creatively to help your client periodically come back to that, so that they're walking away from their interactions with you considering possibilities for a really hopeful future, feeling cared for and caring for others, feeling more centered.
And in terms of thinking and really connecting with that vision of a hopeful future, Richard, for those coaches or just any of us listeners or humans who want to help others through connecting with the PEA and that sense of hope, it can seem at the moment as if we're moving from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis, the state of perma-crisis.
That's right.
We are operating in the era of 24-hour news cycles who are, in a way, seem to be stoking that, as well as war, drought, famine, floods, all happening right now. So what's your piece of wisdom or insight into how we can individually increase our resilience,
right,
and increase those moments of renewal for us in a world and in a future in which increasingly it seems to be further bad news and
right,
hope seems to be diminishing?
At every level, from cellular fears about the next variant of COVID to inflation and, as you said, the global crisis of political instability and the threats of either actual war or imminent war on other borders or at sea. Okay, so part of it is the appreciation that human beings are amazingly adaptive. I mean, there have been many times in our history on this planet that we have faced annihilation, and yet we didn't. I actually believe we will come out of this. But in the midst of all this apocalyptic sense, especially, as you said, from the really bad move of watching the news too often, it turns out that watching the news on TV is even worse than reading it physiologically. But the question ends up being, and here's another example just to affirm your characterization, George, of this, is that we were seeing a lot of movies about superheroes. And even the latest launches on some of the streaming things with the prequel to the Game of Thrones and the Age of Dragons or whatever it's called, and the Lord of the Rings. I mean, we're all fixated with superheroes right now. Well, this happens when our societies feel desperate. I mean, it wasn't odd that in the 1930s, during the midst of the Great Depression in the United States and in several other countries, a number of superheroes like Superman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, the Green Hornet, it goes on and on. They were created in the early 30s. Well, we're seeing that again. In a sense, this is a call for help. Well, what can break the cycle? See, that's what we're talking about. How do we break the cycle? And I think you said it very well. It starts with each one of us. Well, we owe it to ourselves, to this special gift we have from our God of life, is not to squander it. And what that means is we want to do things that remind us, that allow us to re-experience some of these emotions that I'm calling the PEA or the renewal emotions of hope, of caring, of playfulness, of centeredness. So how do we do that? In the last chapter of our book that came out 2 years ago on helping people change, Professors Ellen Van Osten and Melvin Smith and myself, we decided to put the challenge of how do you use compassion, coaching with compassion in all of our lives. And we opened the chapter reminding the readers that we're living in a time of rampant narcissism. I mean, if you're not sure that we are living in excessively narcissistic times, ask yourself, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? Okay, so what's the antidote to narcissism? Caring for others. And, it's one of the things that we know stimulates compassion and some of the really good things inside of somebody is caring for a dog or a cat, or in some parts of the world, it could be a monkey or a horse. But it turns out, and we've known this, sets up this parasympathetic activation when you pet or stroke. It doesn't work with fish or birds, but sometimes people have fish and they use it to get to a different one of those emotions, not the caring compassion, but the mindfulness, because watching them can put you in a state, whether you're scuba diving or snorkeling or at an aquarium. So the challenge to us is, how do you make sure that when you interact with others today, that at some point you're going to have one or more interactions with somebody today in which you step outside of yourself. You stop worrying about your future and your life, and you think about them, and you ask about them, and you listen, and you care. I think if we started doing that more individually, we get the benefit, they get the benefit. At some point, a number of those people will try it with others, and the cascade gives a lot of people a break from all this chaos. And as long as we're feeling amid the chaos and the apocalyptic path we're hurtling down, we are closed neurologically, mentally, we are closed to other possibilities. So what's happening right now that's an extension of this exceedingly negative thinking and excessive narcissism is we've lost the ability interpersonally to be open to new ideas. I mean, let's look at any of our politicians on any side of whatever the spectrums are in any country. I've been in about 6 countries in the last year and a half, and every country is fighting this thing that certainly in the US and the UK we see with this polarization of attitudes, where people can't even say, here's the issue. What are the different views of it? They say, here's the issue, and either you're good or you're bad. And if you agree with us, you're good, and if you don't agree with us, you're bad. I mean, our political leaders, the President of the United States, just the other day, kissed off half of the population of the U.S. as horrible. I don't know if
it sounds like binary thinking.
Yeah, well, the binary thinking is fed by the negativity, which closes us down, literally, perceptually. I mean, when you spray epinephrine or adrenaline into a person's nose, which stimulates the body's stress response, their peripheral vision goes from 180 degrees down to 30. And then if you spray oxytocin at their nose, which stimulates the parasympathetic nerve, goes back out to 180. So what happens classically is when you're under stress, and even mild stress does this, you don't see what's happening around you. You're not seeing what your competitors are doing. You're not seeing what your children are feeling. You're not noticing the natural environment. You're just not noticing. And in the case that I'm talking about, where many of our supposed leaders are so narrow, championing one way of looking at things, they're ignoring the possibility that there might be other ways to look at it. And where do we bring people together if we won't even listen to them? So that's another benefit to each of us interrupting that kind of simplistic binary thinking, as you said, in ourselves, nevertheless with others. And it doesn't mean you have to walk around getting into political arguments all the time or tackle heavy social issues. I'm suggesting it starts with just giving yourself a hormonal break and getting into this renewal PEA moment. I mean, one of the things I have in the courses I teach at my university, in the programs I teach in, the average age of my students is 44. They fly in from different cities and countries for these residencies. One a master's in organization development, one an executive MBA, and one's an executive doctorate. Those folks are usually around 50. And one of the things I have them all do is I have them practice coaching to peers with compassion. And I have them actually use a variety of techniques that they learn in the class and in the readings to bring the person into the PEA and keep them there for an hour by talking about vision, who helped them, things like that. And the notion isn't that you can keep somebody in the PEA for the whole hour. That's impossible. But it's that each time you watch them, you're watching their nonverbals and their tone and everything else. Every time you see them slipping into the NEA, you bring them back to the PEA. And what they say, and 60% of the people in my executive MBA, by the way, are surgeons. And their reaction to this kind of exercise is, oh my God, have I been missing opportunities in all of my conversations? Even the accomplished coaches will sometimes say, I've been spending so much time responding to the corporate mandate with the people I'm coaching in this company that I stopped really focusing on them. And that's where, it's easy for us to slip away from it. But it's amazing how much we can start with ourselves with these moments, extend it to others, and just increase the frequency. And at some point, we may be open enough to other people and other ideas that we may find not just a rapprochement, but we may find a new higher level of thinking where we share the same vision or dream or sense of purpose. And we're not just fixated on how we disagree.
There's a lot of wisdom in there, Richard, both in the coaching space and far beyond. And sort of drawing a thread through some of what we've spoken about today, it sounds like there's some traditional coaching practices and some traditional coaching even competencies, which from your experience and the research that you've done seem out of date or invalid. And my curiosity is how you see the current state of the coaching industry and where you'd like to see the coaching industry evolve or mature into.
I love that question, George, because I'm a member of the board of directors of the Thought Leadership Institute of ICF. It's one of the 6 organizations that compose ICF. I was one of the founding board members, and I had the pleasure, because we're devoted to kind of helping people think about the future and the possible role of coaching. And I had the pleasure of organizing and hosting 36 of the leading scholars of coaching from around the world, and then another dozen of some of the leading practitioners to focus on what's the future of coaching in terms of what research do we need to increase our understanding so that our intellectual foundation isn't just kind of prejudicial common beliefs. Now, I got into thinking about this as I was doing coaching for a number of reasons. One is, you mentioned competencies. To date, there is not one study validating any competencies of a coach as helping clients change. None. All of the competency models used by any of the associations and any of the competency models used by any training programs or organizations are built on the beliefs of the people doing it, or they say, okay, let's get our beliefs together and create a Delphi technique. Well, in my 1982 book, in Research Against Performance of Managers, looking at all different levels, from supervisory to presidents and CEOs, we asked that question. We asked people in all these different organizations at all these different levels, which are the characteristics, the competencies you need to be an effective manager. And then we happen to assess them in terms of their actual behavior. Critical incident interviews about incidents at work in which we coded and processed, and then other tests. And when we looked at what people said was needed versus what actually the research showed led to outstanding performance, not just adequate, but outstanding performance, we found that 50% of the things that people said were needed were actually true. 25% were irrelevant. So the time you were spending pursuing them or assessing them or training them was wasted. And 25%, and here's the scary part, were opposite to what produced effectiveness. That meant that when you use value-based or opinion-based or Delphi-based techniques to create models to train or certify people, half of the effort is being wasted or misleading. So one of the ones we've begun to cover already is this idea that the context for an initial coaching conversation has to be the client's presenting problem. And we've now shown in several fMRI studies and several hormonal studies that if you take that, you close the person down. It has the opposite effect to what you're trying to do. So now it's not that, of course, you want to solve their problem. And of course, you want to get specific in terms of goal setting. But all of that has a very useful role later in the coaching process, not in the early stages. And by looking at the research, and most of the stuff has been done in the last 15 years, it becomes very clear that there's a sacred cow. And I like and I appreciate your notion that kind of things have changed, because I published one of the studies in 1970 showing that if you set specific goals, you're more likely to change. Okay, so I'm the perpetrator of some of that belief, but we understand more now. So that's one issue that I think ends up being important. I think the other thing we often fall prey to is the imposition of our mandate from the purchaser of our services. Now I'm speaking to coaches in particular, and that we confuse our ethical and, if you will, moral position as a helper of individuals, or in some cases teams, to being the execution of the wishes of whoever's paying us. And I think that raises a lot of dilemmas for coaches, and whether you call them ethical dilemmas or just practical dilemmas, they're a real mess, because the more you keep thinking about this instrumentality, the more you as a coach are putting blinders on. Anyway, so what we did, we had 3 2-hour conversations, and we had them at different times of the day so we could get everybody from Australia and all these things, different times. And we pulled all the, now we chose 3 themes. They weren't the only themes, but there were 3. One was, what are the desired outcomes of coaching? Which was fascinating, because, the evidence of the efficacy of coaching is building, but it's not that great yet, except in health outcomes. We've seen a few more meta-analyses with randomized treatment-controlled trials and all that. So, we can have confidence that what we're trying to do in general is more likely helping than not. But until you get to the desired outcomes, you get to be it's a very awkward thing, because if the desired outcome is all measured in terms of client satisfaction, would you recommend this coach to somebody? Did you enjoy it? I could, as a scientist, say that could be a result of cognitive dissonance reduction. I just spent all this time and money. Of course it helped. And a very famous Brit, Hans Eysenck, in the 50s, published a series of studies done at the former version of the NHS in the UK, showing that people went through psychotherapy for a year. People who were diagnosed with depression improved, but so did the people who were put on the waiting list for a year. They actually improved just as much. And by the way, so did the people who just saw their general practitioner for a year, improved just as much. So it raises the humility that we need, which is why I think we need more research. That led us to a profound discussion about, in whose eyes, in a sense, who's the client, or do you call them the coachee, the client, the learner, whatever. The second theme was, what are the processes and mechanisms that enable coaching to be more effective? Well, obviously, part of that depends on how you define the first question, but of the outcomes. But there we got into some fascinating things about the psychophysiology. Angelo Passarelli of the College of Charleston talked about that, and Melvin Smith, one of my colleagues and co-authors. Eric DeHaan talked about these micro moments in the coaching conversation that, in the research that he and his colleagues and graduate students are doing, is just marvelous at unfolding the insight about where these kind of pivotal moments occurring. And then the third theme was, what about coaching particular people or contexts? So we wanted to look at issues of gender differences, racial differences, cultural, faith, etc. And we produced a set of videos, which the Thought Leadership Institute of ICF has on our website. We also produced an academic article that I was proud to take the lead on, that the group of us that did, everybody's listed in the appendix of the article who was at the meetings and in the conversations, and a lot of our people are quoted throughout. But that came out in the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, and it came out in the January. Well, actually, it came out online in January. It came out in print just this past month. And it's open access. We paid extra to make sure that if anybody went to the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science, looked at the future of coaching, and they found our article, I was the lead author, so it's Boyatzis et al. They can download it for free. And we did this because we wanted to encourage more graduate students, more faculty, more coaches to participate in research. I mean, I'm trying to do a study on the competencies of coaches leading to client outcomes. I've been trying to collect this data for 3 years. I've approached over 20,000 coaches begging people to participate. And, we now have a few hundred coaches, but we don't yet have enough of the coaches also bringing some of their clients to us, because you can't really judge the competencies unless we see client change. So it's hard. It's hard because coaches are doing such impactful work, and it raises all sorts of questions if you participate in research. So we ended up by saying, yeah, here are things that every coach, not just coach researchers, should do. Consider helping in research. Consider joining with some colleagues mostly in universities, sometimes in consultancies, in doing some research studies, and basically participating in the conversation, not just trying to be jingoistic and saying, yes, we have the greatest snake oil version of coaching. If you coach this way, you'll be healed. But to raise the question all the time, how can we make it better? How can we make it more responsive to people's needs who are different than we are? Mm-hmm. So I think coaching is on this moment, this magical moment, and it's like a lot of things that happened between 1450 and 1550 when almost every aspect of our lives changed with discoveries. And in 500 BC, we had another one of those 100-year eras where major religions were formed. It feels like we're in one of those right now, and in particular around the notion of coaching. I think there's research that is starting, and we're seeing a lot more articles being published that are not just opinions, this is how you should do coaching, or tell-all books, but actual based on research, so that when you do the informing people how to do it better, you have some intellectual integrity. So I think this is a great time for coaching.
It sounds like that sense of academic and data-driven integrity has been something that you've been really passionate about in all the decades you've been working in and around coaching. And it sounds like you've been a big role in that data happening and getting put out there.
Well, I hope I've helped. I do really believe that just feeling, it's important to feel like you're doing good work, and it's important to feel like you care about it and there is a noble purpose. But at some point, we have to challenge our belief system to make sure, and that's where I use the term integrity, that we're actually doing the things we think we're doing. And that's where good research comes in. It can be qualitative or quantitative. There are a lot of different forms of research, so I'm not arguing for any one particular method. But I am saying that without asking the question, is it working? How can it work better? With whom? When? How? Then what we're not doing is opening the door to new possibilities. And I think we owe it to the people who are our clients, and we owe it to ourselves.
And I've asked you about your thoughts on the industry as a whole, the sort of maturation and growth. And I'd like to ask the same question, but more at the individual level. So for all the coaches listening, all the leaders who coach, and all the members of the ICF and the AC and the EMCC, what encouragement or stretches would you like to encourage all the coaches listening to lean into?
One I mentioned before, because we're in a noble profession, it gets easy for us to be so moved by that and our sense of purpose or calling that we forget to do the maintenance, or more hopeful, the renewal work on ourselves. We continue to pursue it. And, so a divorce or heart attack later, we end up saying, or when your kids ask you for an appointment to be able to talk to you, you end up saying, what am I not doing right? Well, instead of waiting till those bad things happen, why don't we do, in a sense, practice what we preach? Why don't we make sure that in the pursuit of our work, we don't lose ourselves in our lives. And I'm not saying this because I criticize the amount of narcissism, but I do think there is a level at which self-care is important, and that you're not going to be inspirational to anybody else if you don't feel inspired about life. So using these notions of PEA and renewal for yourself ends up being a very important way for you to sustain your work. That's one level. Second level, consider the other persons that you're working with, whether you call them a client or whatever. Consider their excitement. Consider their awe, their curiosity, because that will help us to lift things out of solving just one problem to opening doors, to help them open doors to futures that have more meaning to them. Because very often the presenting problems they come to us with are a result of a whole bunch of increasingly narrow limits of their perception. And I think when we do that, it's really good. I as I mentioned to you before, I'm averaging, I think, some weeks 2 or 3, but I averaging 1 podcast or webinar a week, and have been for like 3 years now. I'm trying to write my new book so I can just give people the book and have a few less. But in some sense, this is a partial antidote to my need to be interacting with people live, which I've been denied because of COVID. I am flying back to Cleveland and teaching my classes face to face, but most of the time, this ends up being an important part of the conversation. And I think that we now know that the effects of long COVID from several meta-analyses of neurological studies, even mild Omicron, you didn't have many symptoms, is a measurable deterioration of some of the white matter in a part of the brain located near the ventral medial prefrontal cortex that has a lot to do with our social interactions. If deterioration in some of that neural connectivity is occurring at the same time that we're feeling more socially isolated and more people are giving into nervousness and staying away, what we're doing is making it worse, when in fact what we need to be doing is finding more ways to being with others, both playing with others and dancing and making music, as well as helping and working and chatting and all those kinds of things. So I think those are the pieces that in a larger sense can help us think about the very question you opened today's conversation with, which is talking about resonant relationships. Relationships are the context for everything we do. So spending more time in our relationships, enjoying our relationships, will help. And I think the more, as we talked about, even the horrible stuff going on at the often community and political level, where people stop listening to ideas because they're self-righteously guaranteed that they're the ones that are right. That's not a recipe for adaptation. That's a recipe for extinction. So, I'm reminded of, sometimes I start talking like this and I say to myself, oh my God, you're sounding like the old Coca-Cola jingle. I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. Not like me, but actually in harmony. But, to some extent, I'm not saying John Lennon was writing all of his things, but boy, he was writing a lot of them. And when he used that phrase, all you need is love, he was capturing a very, very crucial part of our fabric, our relationships.
And I'm reminded hearing you speak about, the really interesting neuroscience and whole body data around a sense of spirituality and how some sort of faith, whether it be religious or otherwise, can have amazing effects for our own well-being and our performance as people, coaches, leaders.
Tony Jack, the colleague, the neuroscientist and philosophy professor at Case that I work with and is a good friend, he started a question, having grown up in Oxford. Both of his parents were Dons. He went to Oxford. And And he was always worried that the atheism movement within the UK had gotten to fervor levels. And I had noticed a comparable movement in the US where there were certain people of certain political persuasions who would basically say, well, if you're a member of some faith, you must be stupid. And there was a chain of studies shown in cognitive psychology showing if people have professed more faith or spirituality, they do score lower on cognitive reasoning tests. So Tony approached me and a couple colleagues, and we did a series of studies, 8 to be specific, and ended up publishing it, in which we were able to show, yeah, it's true that people who have more faith or spiritual practice very often are less analytic, but they're more empathic, they're more social, they're less depressed. So it's a part of this theoretical framing of that Tony Jack has done a lot of research on opposing domains of what happens in the opposition of the task positive network versus the default mode, or what he calls the analytic versus the empathic networks. But the question also boiled down to, when you talk about this, are you talking about cognitive intelligence of certain forms of analytic reasoning, or are you talking about emotional and social intelligence? And it became very clear in the pattern of our results that anybody trying to make a global statement about this was missing the story. Mm. Now, it did lead to one unfortunate quote, the headline that the Daily Mail picked up on one of their issues from our discussion section was, and they misquoted it, was a statement that atheists have psychopathology. But I think what we were trying to say was a little simpler than that, is that it's not as simple as saying how analytic can you be. And when we look at some of the other things that happen when people are in a spiritual moment, they stimulate a lot of this prayer to a loving God. If you're praying to a vengeful God, it actually goes the opposite way. It narrows you down. It puts you in the negative emotional attractor. Praying to a loving God, according to the people who study this stuff, ends up putting you into this state that I associate with the positive emotional attractor and renewal. So it really does help you open up.
And as someone, I was born in '86 in the UK, and I've grown up in a largely what feels like atheist or
right,
increasingly secular society, and yet, while I don't subscribe to a particular religion, I'm confident and comfortable to refer to myself as spiritual. So, is there any data or research you've done around the spirituality of, call it atheists or Gen Z or millennials, and how maybe, while not subscribing to a particular religion or doctrine, how our physiology or the way our mind works changes while being spiritual and yet not subscribing to spiritual but not religious, should we say?
Yeah, to answer your question directly, George, yeah, the answer is yes. Now, that hides the fact that people are still professing formal religions at huge amounts. And it varies by country or culture. Certainly, the growth of people in Islam is dramatic, as is the growth in, just to pick one, in North America of evangelicals, which are not even any recognized sects of Christianity. So I don't want us to believe the certain of the mythologies, whether in the UK or the US, that somehow people are going to church less often, because that's a limited definition of professing a certain faith. But if we add to that spiritual practice, which we did, by the way, so those studies that I'm talking about that Tony led, that we did, that got published, we asked people the questions about religion or spiritual practices. So yes, there are ways that people make links to spiritual practices, including some of the physiological practices like yoga or Tai Chi or meditation, that your intent in doing them may not be to find spiritual oneness, but it is certainly a very measured and validated consequence of it. People feel more one with, which is a spiritual state. Um, and it even infuses our popular mythology. May the force be with you is a spiritual statement. So I think, and so the answer to your question is yes, whether it is a form of spirituality or belief in life forces or an organized religion, if you are involved in it, it usually has the beneficial consequences we're talking about.
And Richard, as we start to draw our conversation to a close today, and it feels like I've spent an hour and 10 minutes in the PEA with you, which I'm really grateful for. It sounds like one of the summaries that you'd encourage would be for our listeners to not just focus on the goal or the topic presenting, but to really open up and have the confidence to coach the whole person and be okay opening a line of inquiry that's holistic and 360 about how life is, how what dreams lie ahead, to really open up the field of vision when it comes to coaching inquiry.
Yeah, and what I'd say is do that responsibly. So if you're a coach, realize that when you're in the coaching conversation, you're not a therapist, but you use some of the same skills and orientation and sensitivities, but there are certain topics you should stay away from. Or if they become open to you or the person reveals them to you, you should make a referral. And unless you're a clerically trained coach or a pastoral counselor and coach, obviously one of those is a spiritual, that you may refer them to somebody who can help or guide them spiritually. And there's certain other topics that you kind of stay away from because it's not a part, I mean, whether you're trained in it or not, it's not a part of your actual psychological contract, if you will. But aside from those few kind of third rails, I would say, yeah, the more holistic, the better. That's who we are. Every time we compartmentalize in our lives, it chews up psychic energy because we have to invest a certain amount keeping those things separate. When people talk about having a separate personal life versus business life, it's horrible because it means they're using up a part of their talent. Yeah. So being holistic is true. And
yeah, I really relate to that.
And balance is true. Now, a lot of things that I've been talking about have to do with balance. And I like to point out to people, it's not just because I'm a Libra. And 7 of my 9 planets, I still include Pluto, were in Libra in the hour that I was born. But I think it's truly because however our bodies came about through spiritual intervention or intelligent design or savvy evolution, we actually exist with a set of balances going on.
Well, and Richard, for those listeners who, so you mentioned books and articles and podcasts and videos. For those that want to keep in touch and follow your work, where can you signpost listeners towards?
Okay, a number of resources. One, from a practitioner perspective and a coach's perspective, our book, Helping People Change, that came out in late 2019, Harvard Business Review published it, Boyatzis, Smith, and Van Osten. We'll talk about this research, but in terms of people's stories. We have a series of MOOCs that are available on Coursera. One I did on inspiring leadership through emotional intelligence, and one that Ellen, Melvin, and I did on coaching, and it's called, I think, Conversations That Inspire. We've had about 1.5 million people sign on to these, so it seems to, there's a lot of 10-minute videos and exercises. If you're a part of an organization and you'd like to be more involved in keeping up with the latest, our coaching research lab at Case Western Reserve University encourages corporate members, sponsors, to help us fund the research. And in exchange for that, people get to have various members of their organization attend several meetings a year and be a part of a lot of these conversations on the research and how to use it. And I think those are, some of the simple ways. Of course, if you want to get more into it, we have a certificate program in coaching to the PEA, which we call Coaching with Compassion, in our executive education operation at Case. And then if you really want to get even more into it, the Masters in Positive OD has the coaching track as one of the skill mastery units within it. I teach in it, and Melvin Smith does, and Ellen Van Osten.
Awesome. All very exciting, Richard.
Thanks.
Well, Richard, thank you so much. I'm full of gratitude for our conversation today. It went to so many interesting places. Is there anything that you'd like to say by way of closing today?
You've been brilliant at tapping into every possible thought I have. So, yeah, I would say you've tapped each one of the dimensions. So, thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Association for Coaching. Discover more business and coaching resources, thought leadership, and online learning at associationforcoaching.com.